From 1878 to 1968, there were 71 lake captains that called Bayview, Wisconsin, on the shore of Lake Michigan, their home. While they lived here, they captained 195 different ships, from tugboats to schooners to steamships, in voyages that took them to every one of the Great Lakes. Join us now for another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we explore not only these captains, but also their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes.
Hi everybody, welcome back for another episode. I'm speaking to you today from the backyard just on the other side of the fence at 515 East Lincoln Avenue. Surrounded by roses, and the lilies are about to come up here. Been pretty hot lately, but we're going to persevere and do some more episodes. This one's going to be a little strange. Not strange. It's going to be different, a different format than anything else I've done. And the reason I'm doing it is because it provides the story of Captain John Brotch while he lived in his house, one of his greatest sailing adventures. It's one thing to look at a house and say, hey, a lake captain lived there, house in Bayview especially, but if you know what happened to him while he lived there, in terms of what sailing adventures he had, it adds a whole nother dimension to it. And that's what this story is going to do today. Now, it's a long one. Before editing it, it's probably going to be about 2 hours. And what it is it's basically an audio book. I've done 5 chapters, I think, here for you, all focused on this one story, and even then it doesn't include there. You'd have to get the book to read the rest of it. But I think it provides the essence of what happened to him while he was captain of the schooner Arctic, owned by his wife, Johanna Brotch, Bayview's only female ship owner, while they both lived in this house. So kind of interesting, I think kind of exciting when you hear what happened. This story has it all. There's a storm, there's a you know, great drama that goes with that on sailing ships of the 19th century, which the Arctic was. It also has a lighthouse that features prominently in the story, key part of the story. So this one has got all of it. And what I did is I added conversations to make it readable in prose, which you're never supposed to do as a historian. No, no, no. But I did it anyway. Because it doesn't change the truth of the story. It happened exactly as it's described. But I thought it would, by including fictitious conversations, that it would bring a level of clarity maybe to those that aren't familiar with sailing or the Great Lakes, lake captains' jobs and what happened and how they lived and how they sailed and those kinds of things. And so I went ahead and did it. Now, understand, I've been to sea quite a bit, so I know how things work in that general overall regard. And I feel confident that what I've done here for you is pretty accurate. And I've studied it for years, so this isn't just a happenstance throw together compilation. I worked really, really hard on this for you. It's unique to Bayview. It's a great story of a Bayview lake captain and the dangers that he faced out on the lakes. It's just, it has it all. So, maybe most important now in terms of why now? Why are we getting this now? A 2-hour thing? We haven't only covered maybe 20 of the captains so far. And the reason is that coming up here in less than a month now, there's going to be the dedication ceremony of the Wisconsin Historic Marker in front of this house. And John Brotch is on there. You may recall he was Bayview's most prolific schooner captain, and his wife Johanna owned the schooner that he sailed, schooners that he sailed around the lakes. So that marker dedication from the Wisconsin Historical Society is coming up in 3 weeks. This is the only time in the state that a historic marker, according to what I found, what I researched, what I looked at, the only time in the state that a historic marker has been provided to a female ship owner's house, a Great Lakes ship captain's house, female entrepreneur's house, and it's all here in this one marker. First in the state, ladies and gentlemen, first. Kind of unique, kind of special, so there's a special story that goes with it. So if you come to the marker ceremony here on the 13th of July, Saturday at 11 a.m., and you look at the house, you can know one of the stories that John Brotch, the captain that lived here, encountered while he lived here, out on the lakes. So it's special. This marker is the only one in Bayview, only the third, the first one in 27 years, and the only one in Bayview for a historic house. So lots of firsts, lots of importance to this marker. And now here's the big story that goes with it. And again, there were many aspects to the house, such as the episode I just did last week on William Draves, Bayview's greatest rags to riches story. Johanna's brother, John Brotch's brother-in-law, and it was William Draves that built this house. You can go back and check that episode if you want. Pretty interesting. So that's all rolled into one here, folks. Simon Stanhope is our professional narrator, theater-trained narrator from England. He is going to do the narration for you. I don't have as many slides in this one because it is an audio book, because it is 2 hours. So you'll have to treat this one more as not a visual experience, but an audio experience. I have slides that are there. Some, definitely pertain. Some are generic to the events. I did my best to put together what I could for you. But it's an audio book portion, really. And so I hope you'll enjoy it. And come to the ceremony on the 13th of July, Saturday, 11 a.m., and you get to see the marker dedicated. So, with that, I will sign off and say, as a reminder, hats off to all our Bayview Lake captains. You all have a nice summer. Hope you enjoy the video, and take care. Bye-bye.
Welcome to another installment of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we discuss the lives of the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview, Wisconsin, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the age of sail and steam. This discussion will include their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes. Today we will be providing you, the viewer and listener, with something different from our prior episodes. We're going to be reading 5 short chapters from the book A Brother Helps His Sister, the true story of William A. Draves, the schooner Arctic, and the house at 515 East Lincoln Avenue. These 5 chapters detail a tremendous sailing adventure of Captain John Brotch when he lived at 515 East Lincoln Avenue, and was captain of the schooner Arctic. Captain Brotch, who was Bayview's most prolific schooner captain, was also the husband of Johanna Brotch, Bayview's only female shipowner. She owned the schooner Arctic during the time of this story, handling the business affairs of the ship, while John did the sailing. Prior to this story, which takes place in Lake Huron, Captain Brotch had sailed the Arctic for 4 years into all but one of the Great Lakes. This particular adventure of Captain Brotch, and he had many during his 17 years as a Great Lakes ship captain, is being featured in its own episode here to coincide with the dedication of the first and only historic marker in the state of Wisconsin, honouring either a lake captain or a female shipowner. It happens, in this case, that this marker applies to both categories, and, amazingly, both are found in the same house at 515 East Lincoln Avenue in Bayview. This historic marker of the Wisconsin Historical Society will be dedicated in the front yard of Johanna and John Brotch's house this summer, on Saturday the 13th of July, 2024, at 11 a.m. It will also be only the 3rd such marker in Bayview, and the only one of the 3 for a historic house. So, as the date approaches, we thought it would be interesting to hear not only one of Captain Brotch's great adventures on the lakes, but one in which he demonstrated great courage and heroics, and one which also occurred while he lived in the house with wife Johanna and their 6 children at 515 East Lincoln Avenue. One more thing we want to tell you before this episode begins. In order to properly convey the drama of this true story, Commander Mintline, author of the scripts, books, and YouTube channel, felt it necessary to step away for a moment from the strictly factual Bayview Lake Captain biographies in all previous episodes, and instead, just for this story and episode, invent conversations between the people involved, and create on his own some of the missing pieces based upon his years of seagoing experience and his extensive research and analysis of the data discovered. He believes he got it right, and hopes you will forgive him using this structure in order to convey the real emotion, courage, and spirit of all those involved. None of these parts, he added, changes any of the truth of the actual event or its aftermath. So, without further delay, we will now begin this narration of these 5 chapters. It starts with chapter 43, and a line from a historic and famous poem, written by one of the greats of English literature. Chapter 43. Charmed magic casements, opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. John Keats, Ode to a Nightingale, 1819. Unlike the sailing season of 1892, the sailing season of 1893 was the best ever. John Brotch sailed the schooner Arctic as captain to ports all over the Great Lakes with great efficiency and productivity, without even the slightest incident. He proved he was not only competent, but a Great Lake captain. Jenny found she was more than capable of handling all their business affairs for the ship from their home at 515 East Lincoln Avenue. In fact, she excelled at it. The husband-wife partnership for the running of the business known as the Draves family schooner Arctic was a spectacular success, though now it probably should be called the Brotch family schooner Arctic. There was even an 1893 news article on famous Great Lakes ships of the period that included the Arctic, noting that it was owned by a person named J. Brotch, which is John Brotch's wife Johanna, and referring to the Arctic, along with 11 other ships, as one of the legendary ships of the Great Lakes. Jenny and John made enough profit to pay for all necessary normal end-of-year maintenance, plus winter storage costs in advance, a first for John Brotch in his sailing career. Not only that, but there was also even enough money to buy new shoes and winter clothes for all 6 children. Oh, things were going extremely well. After the Arctic was put away for storage for the winter, John and Jenny sat down every afternoon in their 2 chairs by the coal heater in the parlour and enjoyed the company of their children. Jenny's sister-in-law, Emily Draves, had taught Jenny how to play the piano so well that Jenny now began to teach her own children. John also shared his books with them, sitting them on his lap and helping them learn to read. That winter of 1893 to 94 was the best winter they had ever had. For the first time in many years, Jenny and John had money in their pocket, and the children had everything they needed. There was even a chance to splurge a little for Christmas gifts for them. Finally, contentment had entered Jenny and John's lives. The new sailing season of 1894, beginning in mid to late April, also started well for the Arctic. From 15th April to 15th May, John Brotch captained it as usual to various Great Lakes ports. There was always that point in time, even for those ashore, when everyone wondered when spring would leave and summer would arrive. For sailors especially, the arrival of summer importantly signalled stable and less stormy weather. Now, as the days progressed from April towards the end of May, lake captains and their crews became antsy with anticipation, as the warm, sunny, and stable weather of June and summer was almost within reach. Such was the case for John Brotch and his crew on the Arctic, as they successfully navigated their way up the crowded and busy with shipping St. Clair River, heading up past Detroit, Michigan, and into Lake Huron on the 18th of May, 1894. It was an early, sunny morning, but it was still spring, and, as this captain and crew all well knew, spring weather could turn bad in mere minutes. There were no weather satellites orbiting the Earth in 1894 to provide perfect images of weather patterns, especially approaching fronts that would bring storms with them. Nor were there weather stations, or even locations that housed weather collection instruments to gather data like wind direction and speed, humidity, temperature, and then forward it instantaneously to centralized computers to assemble it, plot it, and then broadcast multicolour images every 15 minutes to people's iPhones of approaching storms. None of this existed. The only weather forecasting available to lake captains in 1894 was an aneroid or mercury barometer they kept on the inside of the ship's cabin bulkhead. There was nothing scientific about it either. Barometers of that time, and still today, measure changes in barometric pressure brought about by weather fronts. Low pressure indicates bad weather. High pressure indicates good weather. As the air pressure fluctuates, the mercury inside moves. As the mercury moves, a small arrow connected to it also moves. As the pressure changes, and the mercury moves, and the arrow moves, the dial on the barometer is pointed to by the arrow. On a typical dial, there were words spread across it: fair, change, rain, stormy. Experienced lake captains of the 1890s, like John Brotch, knew, however, that by the time the barometer began to change, say from fair to change, it was too late. Yes, a barometer was an indicator, but it was useful to sailors moored as a backup. Its best use came when the ship was out on the lakes, with no contact with land. There was more time here, though not much, to tell when a storm was coming. So, captains of the time really relied on their own experience to detect bad weather. A slight temperature change, new cloud formations of the type that would bring storms, and a slight increase in the wind. These were the key indicators for lake captains. The key word is slight change, because if a captain didn't catch it quick, then by the time the major change came, it was too late. The problem for John Brotch that sunny morning, coming up north on the St. Clair River, past Detroit and up towards Lake Huron, was that he was surrounded by land, the industrialized Detroit to port, and Windsor, Canada, to starboard. Plus, this was the Great Lakes' busiest shipping choke point. He had to be sharp and quick to avoid collisions with other vessels in this narrow river. The schooner Arctic had no engine, and thus no ability to turn on a dime. Manoeuvring in a restricted channel like this in a sailing ship was anything but easy. The Arctic didn't sit that high out of the water either, so a good portion of the land on each side of the river would have obscured these very slight changes in temperature, wind speed, and direction, and cloud visibility he needed to detect a coming storm. Timing in life is everything. Throughout history, differences between great moments of happiness and great moments of disaster have not infrequently been measured in minutes. This was the case with Captain John Brotch and his crew of the Arctic early this sunny morning. Skillfully, he negotiated his way through all the heavy shipping traffic on the St. Clair River, barking orders and handling the helm with astute quickness to avoid other vessels. It took his 100% concentration to do so. Finally, it was a relief to see the open Lake Huron just in front of him, 1/3 of a mile ahead. He took a long breath, thankful to have made it through. As the opening approached, he had the crew fully raise every sail to the top of the mast, including the jib-boom sails, to prepare to go out from the narrow-channeled river into the wide-open lake. Out they went, into the freedom of being able to relax for a moment, the stress of negotiating the narrow channel now behind them. They traversed north into Lake Huron for a little over 5 miles, and making about 15 knots, about 20 miles per hour, under full sail, when John Brotch first noticed a wind direction change from the south to the southeast. He ordered the helmsman to maintain course, and then he ran into the cabin to check the barometer. It was falling. Lower pressure and bad weather was approaching. The quick wind direction change signalled a counterclockwise move, the classic indication of a fast-approaching low weather front bringing storms with it. As he ran back out on deck, he noticed the clouds for the first time coming in an altitude just starting to obscure parts of the sky. Why hadn't he caught this earlier? He cursed himself for missing it. He cursed the St. Clair River for diverting his attention with all its traffic, and for the channel's industrialization blocking and confusing the subtle wind and temperature changes he would have spotted immediately out on the open lake. Immediately, Captain Brotch ordered the Arctic to turn around. "Come about to starboard," he hollered. "Stand by all sails." The crew readied at their stations, and the helmsman turned the wheel to port, left, which in those days turned the ship to the right, starboard. John Brotch decided to keep the ship in full sail. He needed speed now. Keeping the sails up during a gale risked them being torn off, and in the process taking the masts with them. It was a risk, but Brotch knew he had only a few miles to go to get back inside the safety of the St. Clair River, and out of the wind on the open lake. He was in a race against time. In the time it took the schooner to reverse course and head back south to Detroit, the clouds began to obscure the sun, and the wind doubled in speed. The wind was now fully from the southeast, meaning the low-pressure system had all but completed its move in. John Brotch knew what came next: the front wall itself, which held the rain, and, more importantly, the gale-force wind. The big problem now was sailing into the wind. Sailors are able to do this by performing a manoeuvre called tacking. This involves crisscrossing the intended direction of sailing in order to get just a portion of the sails filled with wind, since headed directly into the wind would not allow the sails to get any wind at all. So sailing into the wind could be accomplished, sure, but only by tacking. And crisscrossing back and forth severely reduced the actual speed of movement along the intended direction of sailing. So, even though John Brotch was just 5 miles north of the St. Clair River channel, and its safety to get out of the wind on the lake, tacking meant his speed forward along that intended line was reduced to only a few knots. Back and forth, John Brotch tacked the Arctic. They closed the distance to 4 miles. Then 3. John Brotch could see the Fort Gratiot lighthouse beacon just off the Arctic's starboard bow. The lighthouse marked the entrance to the St. Clair River, and safety. Now the wind was exploding in force. Captain Brotch had no choice but to order the jib-boom sails to be taken down completely, and the fore and mainsails reduced to half. This would reduce his speed, but the force of the wind would make up for some of the reduced sail size. If he didn't do this, the wind would tear the sails to shreds, and likely snap off both masts. He had no choice. Immediately after this was done, the clouds, now getting dark, showed lightning bursts and thunder. The front was now visible, and just a couple of miles off to the west, closing fast. But the Arctic was only making maybe 5 knots in actual forward speed. The thunderstorm was moving towards them, across the land, at 40 miles an hour. "Just 1.5 miles to go," shouted Captain Brotch to his crew. He was a veteran of this waterway. Lake captains knew this area well. With the lighthouse and its surrounding buildings clearly visible, the distance was easy to gauge. "All we have to do is make it to the light," he encouraged his crew. Everyone could see the lighthouse, tantalizingly close. They all knew it marked the safety of the river entrance. As the sky was almost completely dark now, though only noon, the blaze of the lone sentinel's light, flashing every 30 seconds as it revolved around the compass, accompanied by periodic bolts of lightning, made for a hugely dramatic scene. Then the rain started. And it didn't start lightly either. It seemed like someone had just turned on a spigot of water, and in mere moments the entire crew and its captain were drenched, their clothes now sticking to them as they worked at their stations. Lightning, thunder, and now rain. John Brotch kept his cool. The mission now was to maintain the tack. The wind had increased to 30 miles per hour now, but the Arctic could still tack in it. The helmsman needed an extra hand to hold the wheel steady, though. Captain Brotch held one side, the helmsman the other. "Stand by to tack to port," Brotch shouted to his crew. Then he said to the helmsman, "Get ready. When I say now, I'll help you with the wheel." The wind seemed to be increasing exponentially now with each minute. In truth, it was now blowing a gale, almost 50 miles per hour. A lightning bolt struck only a few 100 feet away, followed by a huge boom. "Now, tack to port," he shouted. getting harder and harder to hear in the increasing wind. He helped the helmsman turn the wheel as the crew worked the rigging to trim the ship for a port tack. Slowly, agonizingly, into the teeth of the wind, the Arctic began to come around to port as intended. A massive gust of wind, beyond and above the current 50 miles per hour, then hit the Arctic. The force of it almost keeled the schooner over on its side, but the old veteran remained upright. But when it was furthest over, both John Brotch and the helmsman were flung off the ship's wheel like rag dolls and flew up against the ship's rail. If that rail hadn't been there, they would have gone overboard and drowned. Without anyone at the helm, the wheel started to spin like a top, and when it reached its limit, a huge bang and snapping of timber directly below it was heard by the entire crew. John Brotch, clinging to the stern rail for his life, knew right away what had happened. The Arctic's rudder was now gone, ripped off by the force of the storm. Clawing himself off the rail to stand again on the deck, John Brotch knew he had only a few minutes to act to save the lives of himself and his crew. With the rudder gone, there was no way to control the schooner. It was at the complete mercy of the wind and waves, and that wind was hard from the southeast, blowing the ship straight to the shore. There weren't any rocks on this particular shoreline, but it didn't matter in this storm. Eventually the Arctic would contact the bottom close to shore and be stuck. Then the breaking waves, called breakers by sailors for a reason, the equivalent of tons of concrete, would come down on the hull and smash the ship to bits. The crew, even though probably within almost walking distance of the beach, couldn't get there. The power of the waves would drag them back out into the lake to be drowned. In those days, the early 1890s, the only chance any crew of any ship had of surviving if their ship stranded near the beach in a furious storm like this was to get ashore via a life-saving contraption called a breeches buoy. It was a device looking much like today's buoyant circular life-saving ring seen on ships, that was sent out to a stranded ship via a rope shot out from the shore by shotgun. The line would then be affixed to the ship. Then, from the shore, the rescuers would hook up the breeches buoy to the line and then send it out to the ship. One at a time, each crew member would get into it and be winched back to shore above the waves. Safely ashore, the breeches buoy would then be sent out on the rope again to the stranded ship, where the next crewman would crawl in and be pulled ashore, and so on. However, there was a problem with this rescue method. It only worked if the ship was stranded near a life-saving station, so the breeches equipment could be towed along the beach by horse and wagon. In this emergency involving the Arctic, the ship was nowhere near a life-saving station. John Brotch and his crew were alone. No breeches buoy rescue was possible. Time thusly began to run out for the Arctic. "Pull in the sails!" Captain Brotch shouted, barely audible above the howling wind of the now 60 miles per hour gale. The crew did so. Now the Arctic was without sails. The death march to the shore from the wind now began, and they were less than a mile offshore. Being blown by a 60 mile per hour wind, it wouldn't take long. The Arctic was doomed. John Brotch now yelled to the mate who was up forward, helping the crew tie down the lowered sails so they wouldn't catch the wind and snap off the masts. "Edward!" hollered Captain Brotch with all his might, holding his hands round his mouth to try to get his voice to project through this fierce wind and rain. "Let go the anchor!" The mate heard him, and also knew they only had a minute or so left. He dropped the lines he was holding while helping the crew get the foresail tied down, and ran with all his might and speed that his young body had in it, up to the anchor secured in place on the port bow. It was only 50 feet, but in the wind and rain it seemed like 500. Everything now for the mate, John Brotch, and the crew seemed to happen in slow motion. They all watched as the mate made the run to the anchor. It was now their only lifeline. Would he make it before the ship heeled over again in the wind, throwing him into the water? Their lives now depended upon Edward, the mate on the Arctic, making it to the anchor. As he got 5 feet away, time seemed to stop. Edward reached the anchor. Then he grabbed the axe from its secure location inside the rail next to the anchor. It took him just 2 blows, and the secondary line, rope used to secure the anchor to the ship's rail, was cut, releasing the anchor into the raging water. Its main line of iron links, though, connecting it to the ship, was still in place. As the anchor descended down into the lake bed, John Brotch had a flashback to that scary voyage on the Elbe, 11 years earlier. He'd miraculously sailed it through the night, after that horrible collision with the schooner Capella, and, the next morning, in the clearing weather, tried unsuccessfully to make it into port at 2 Rivers. With no sails to control the schooner then, he was headed towards the shore, with no way to stop it. In desperation, he dropped the Elbe's anchor to hold it from going onto the shore. But the anchor didn't hold. He got lucky, though. The storm had passed by then, and the wind was gone. Plus, there was no wave action to damage the Elbe when it reached, fortunately, a sandy beach. Would the anchor hold this time? In this huge gale, blowing 60 miles per hour and whipping up waves of 12 feet, on top of which the Arctic was being tossed around like a toy. 1 little anchor, 7 brave men. Would they now live or die? Together they all awaited their fate. "It's holding!" Both John Brotch and the Arctic's mate, Edward, both exclaimed at the same moment. The crew all briefly held up their hands and gave a brief cheer that was next to inaudible in the massive wind. Then both John Brotch and the mate Edward joined with the crew to finish getting the sails tied up and secured so they wouldn't catch any wind, with resulting force and power that might start dragging the anchor along the bottom. The anchor was secure now, everyone could tell, and they wanted to keep it that way. In 10 minutes, the crew had both large fore and mainsails tied securely to their booms, and the jib-boom sails removed from their lines and stored in the forward sail locker at the bow. Still being held securely at anchor, Captain Brotch then gathered the crew together for just a moment. "Great job, men!" he hollered above the wind and rain as they all clustered together on deck. "There's nothing more we can do now. Let's all go below and get out of this weather and these wet clothes." They all then walked to the stern and down into the cabin. All had got a spare set of clothes, and they all got changed. "Edward, I'll take the first watch," said John Brotch. "You and the crew go get into your racks." The term racks meant bunks where they slept. Fortunately, the Arctic was big enough that each man had his own bunk bed. As each totally exhausted man crawled in, they fell asleep instantly. John Brotch grabbed some coal and got the heater going to provide some warmth to his formerly rain-soaked crew. It was 1 p.m. Then John peered out of the cabin windows into the massive storm. He took bearings on the key features of the shoreline, most notably the Fort Gratiot lighthouse, to fix his position, checking them every 5 minutes. It was tedious, but necessary. If the anchor started to drag, the only way he would know is if these bearings changed. As 30 minutes became an hour, the bearings never changed. It became apparent to John Brotch that whatever part of the lake bottom the anchor had grabbed onto, it had grabbed on with all its might. It was secure. It wasn't going to be dragged anywhere. Alone, and the only one awake now, John Brotch took a deep breath. They had dodged a bullet. Chapter 44. Captain Brotch let the Arctic's mate sleep until midnight. When the captain said he'd take the first watch, he didn't say for how long. Normally, that would have meant 4 hours, so that the mate would have been awoken to stand watch 4 hours later. But this wasn't normally. Brotch knew that everyone was exhausted, as was he, from the extreme ordeal. Now, 8 hours later, he felt Edward had had enough rest to be woken up, to relieve him and stand watch. Really, the captain had reached his limit. If he let Edward sleep any longer, John Brotch might collapse. That's how tired he was now. So he walked the 10 feet over to Edward's bunk, and woke him up to come and stand the next watch. So exhausted was the rest of the crew in their surrounding bunks that they didn't even hear Edward being awoken or getting out of his bunk and getting dressed. Plus, the schooner was rocking and rolling so violently in the huge waves, and creaking and groaning, that any additional noise created by his rising merely fell into the background. After just a few minutes, Edward was up and came over to his captain. John Brotch had put a pot of coffee on the coal stove, and had it fresh and hot, and waiting for Edward when he came over. "Oh, coffee, wonderful!" exclaimed Edward, the mate. "You're welcome," said Captain Brotch. "So I take it we're still holding steady at anchor," said Edward. "Yep," replied Brotch. "Whatever it grabbed hold of down there, and I don't care what it was, it's holding fast and true. We got lucky." "You can say that again," replied the mate. "Man, that was a bad time." "Yes, but we made it," said John. "Now, here's all you have to do. When we still had daylight, I selected 2 points on the shore to keep consistent with compass bearing checks, to make sure we would know if we started to move. But now that daylight's gone, you'll have to use the flash from the lighthouse. Check its bearing every 5 minutes, because we're only 3/4 of a mile offshore. If we don't catch a bearing movement quick and fast, then it will be too late. The wind is still blowing from the southeast, got to be 60 miles per hour, so you'll only have a few minutes to notice if we're moving. That's how strong the wind is, and it will blow us ashore, and fast. Other than that, checking that light every 5 minutes, there's nothing else to do but enjoy your coffee. Wake me immediately if we start to move." "Aye, Captain," said the mate. And with that, John Brotch went off to crawl into the same bunk Edward the mate had just left. He only removed his boots, leaving his still damp clothes on, if he had to act fast, if the anchor started to drag. As he laid his head on the pillow, he thought of wife Jenny and their 6 children, now safe and sound in their house at 515 East Lincoln Avenue, in Milwaukee. Jenny probably got hit with this big storm the day before, as it followed the west-to-east trajectory of North American weather patterns. The wind from it probably took a few trees down here and there, but Jenny's brother and Bayview's greatest success story, William A. Draves, had built the house solid and on a good foundation. He was certain she and the little ones were okay. Just a few seconds later, John collapsed onto his pillow and was out. Just as John Brotch had done with him, the mate Edward let his captain sleep 8 hours. He was still in his bunk when Edward woke him. "Captain, it's 8 a.m., said Edward. "You let me sleep a long time?" said Brotch. "Yes, sir, but all is well, and I figured you needed it, just as I did," replied Edward. "You let me sleep, so I let you sleep." "The anchor is still holding, I take it," replied the captain. "Yes, Captain," said the mate. "Hasn't budged an inch. The bearings are the same as when you left, and the wind has died down a bit." John Brotch got up out of his bunk. The crew, all just kids really, were also stirring. They were so exhausted from the ordeal they slept for 14 hours. John accepted the coffee Edward had waiting for him, as did the crew. The coal heater was large enough to hold 2 pots full, and Edward had made them ready for everyone. As the rest of the crew finished dressing and getting their coffee, John Brotch crawled up the ladder, out through the hatch and onto the deck. Edward was right. The wind was now down to around 30 miles per hour, though gusting. Still a good blow out on the water, but a far cry from the 60 miles per hour they'd fought through yesterday in the emergency. John Brotch saw their position was 2 miles northeast of the lighthouse, close to the 1.5 miles away he'd estimated when they began their final, fateful tack that snapped the rudder. They were also about 3/4 of a mile offshore. He then walked forward from the cabin to the bow to check the anchor line for any weakness that might cause it to break. But there was nothing. It was in good shape, still tight and taut, linking the schooner to the anchor below. He also looked for any damage to other parts of the ship. There were none. The crew had done a good job securing the fore and mainsails to their booms, which were in turn secured by tackle and line to the deck. All looked well. Then he headed back to the stern. The crew was just starting to come out on deck. "Good job to you and the crew, securing the fore and mainsails," Brotch said to the mate. "They held up just fine." "Thank you, Captain," said the mate. "Kind of amazing we got it done in that gale." "Yeah, absolutely amazing," Brotch replied. "Really, we're lucky, too, that when the rudder snapped off it didn't puncture the hull below it. We'd have gone down fast if that had happened. Technically, that rudder should have punctured the hull. Don't know why it didn't." "Agreed," said the mate. "Every time I've heard of rudders going, they always damaged the hull on their way out. It was a miracle for us." "A miracle indeed," replied the captain. "Actually, 2 miracles for us yesterday. The hull not getting punctured by the rudder, and then the anchor holding. God was with us for sure." "For sure," replied the mate. But they both knew a 40-mile-per-hour wind against a ship at anchor was still in great danger, especially one without a rudder. They weren't out of the woods yet. Then John Brotch noticed what appeared to be movement on the shore, less than a mile away. He went down to his cabin and grabbed his spyglass from the small bulkhead locker and came back on deck. He extended the 3-fold brass telescoping spyglass and then held the optics up to his left eye. Then he turned the extension slightly left and right to get it into focus. "Edward, there's somebody on the shore," John Brotch yelled. "Quick, go get the flare gun." The mate ran down into the cabin, opened the bulkhead locker where John Brotch had just taken the spyglass from, took out the flare gun, and with it the box of 5 flares. He ran back up on deck and gave the gun to his captain. Simultaneously, Edward opened up the small flare box and took out 1 flare. John took it with his left hand, then, holding the flare gun in his right, pressed the button on the gun's side with his right thumb. This unlatched the breech, much like opening a shotgun in order to place a shell into the barrel. Now, with the breech open, John loaded the first flare shell into the pistol's barrel with his left hand, then snapped it back closed until it clicked. The flare pistol now ready, he walked to the stern rail, pointed the pistol at the sky, and fired. Chapter 45. The single, lonely sentinel on the shore was the assistant lighthouse-keeper at Fort Gresham Light, Daniel Carrigan. He'd been sent out on horseback by his boss at the light, the lighthouse-keeper Israel Palmer, to get closer to the schooner at anchor, to try to determine if its crew needed help. Earlier that morning at dawn, with the rain gone, both Carrigan and Keeper Palmer had climbed the stairs up to the top of the 82-foot-tall tower, each carrying a spyglass, to look for stranded vessels or shipwrecks that got caught in yesterday's storm. Their primary job was to keep the light burning, yes, but they had a secondary job of looking for ships in distress and notifying the U.S. Life-Saving Service. Using their 3-draw spyglasses from their lofty perch, they spotted the Arctic 2 miles to the north of them and about 3/4 of a mile offshore. At first they thought it had dropped anchor to wait out the storm, so it caused them no concern. That would be the logical conclusion reached by anyone that saw it, with its sails pulled in and its anchor chain taut. They also couldn't at that time make out the schooner's name from the lighthouse. First, they were too far away to see details, and second, the wind had begun to move from southeast to east, as the storm moved through. This created a 40-mile-an-hour wind that spun the Arctic around on the water to show just its starboard side to the lighthouse, making the stern containing the ship's name unviewable. Not seeing anything to concern them, they went back down the stairs to the quarters on the lighthouse's first floor. A couple of hours passed, and daylight was now in full swing. The storm was beginning to subside, though the wind was still blowing hard. Keeper Palmer was now beginning to have second thoughts about the anchored schooner they had spotted earlier. It was now 9 a.m. Palmer, with his assistant Carrigan in tow, decided to climb the stairs again up into the tower to take another look. Upon reaching the top, they could have gone outside onto the small balcony to avoid looking through the tall glass protecting the light. Old glass had distortions in it, but the wind was way too strong, especially at this height, so they remained inside. As they re-examined the mystery schooner, they talked back and forth about what they were seeing. "You know, I'm having second thoughts about that schooner," said the keeper, Palmer. "How so?" replied Assistant Carrigan. "Well, why would it drop anchor out in the open lake in that storm, instead of coming into the protected St. Clair River?" "Maybe its captain tried, but couldn't tack into that southeast gale," offered Carrigan. "Nah, these captains can handle their ships." "Well, then maybe he had to reduce sail to prevent a dismasting, and then couldn't make speed with half the sail size," suggested the Assistant Carrigan. "Perhaps," replied Palmer, "but that blow was 60 miles per hour yesterday. If I'm captain, and the safety of the St. Clair River is only 2 miles ahead, I'm making for it with everything I've got." "So you're saying something is wrong?" "I'm saying something is not right. Look at it. Still there. See, same position. And the wind has now shifted to the northeast as the front passed. Now, if everything was all right aboard, with that northeast wind, all they'd have to do is raise sail and turn to starboard, and the sails would catch it. They wouldn't even have to tack. They could be in Port Huron 30 minutes from now, tied up and off to the pub. And look, both masts are there, but what about the rigging, the booms? We can't see from here. Maybe the sails got ripped away and took some essential rigging with them. With no control, the captain would have dropped anchor in desperation to save their lives. Also notice there's no small boat aboard. They must not carry one. Even if they did, there's no way they could even get it lowered and climb aboard now in these waves, let alone yesterday afternoon during that gale. Or maybe some crew members are injured on that schooner, and the captain is unable to set sail without them. Any number of things could be wrong." "Yes, I can see both masts remain, but can't make any more details," replied Carrigan. "I can see the anchor line is taut, but that's it." "If that ship is in trouble, and for some reason can't get under way, and that line breaks, the wind and waves are still fierce," said Palmer. "That schooner would be blown ashore and smashed to bits, and the crew killed, while you and I could only stand here and watch." "I see what you mean," said his assistant. "If they're in trouble, then we are that crew's only hope," said Keeper Palmer. "I don't want to look back and wonder why we didn't take action to see if they needed help. So, here's what we'll do. While you're up here, help me wind the lighthouse gears to keep the light turning. Then we'll check the wick and top off the kerosene reservoir. Once the light's operation is secure for the next couple hours, I want you to go to the station's barn and saddle up the horse. Then put the emergency rescue kit saddlebags on. Once the horse is readied, I want you to ride up the beach until you're opposite the schooner. That will close the distance by half. You should get a better look, and try to see if there's any trouble aboard. And get the schooner's name off the stern. After that, come back and report what you find to me, and we'll talk about the next step." "Yes, sir," replied Carrigan, the assistant. They got the light all set to operate perfectly for the next 2 hours. Then, as instructed, Dan Carrigan went out to the barn to get the horse ready for the ride. Inside the barn there was also a carriage for 6, and a large wagon. The U.S. Lighthouse Establishment, USLHE, provided these, with the horse, in order for the keepers and their families to be able to get to and from the adjoining town of Port Huron for food and supplies. Often, remote lighthouse stations had to be resupplied by special shipments directly from and by the lighthouse establishment, at great cost. The ones on islands were resupplied by boat, but in this case, with the town next door, the keepers could resupply themselves. Thus, the U.S. Lighthouse Establishment just had to supply the transportation, and the keepers and families could do the work without outside help. This saved the establishment money, plus having the horse gave the lighthouse the added capability to go out and traverse the beach if necessary, to investigate ships in distress, as it was doing in this case. Once the horse had been saddled by the assistant, the only thing left was to get the saddlebags, which were stencilled USLHE, hanging to a nail on the barn's wall. Once these were secured, the assistant buttoned his coat to the top, tied the strings from his hat under his chin, opened the barn door, got up into the saddle, and walked the horse off into the still stiff wind. The shoreline was mostly sandy beach, and the entire area he was headed to was completely isolated and deserted. There were no people living up in that area. Assistant Carrigan wasn't a bad rider, but he preferred not to gallop if he didn't have to. So he mostly walked the horse at a good pace, occasionally getting into a light trot. In about 20 minutes, he reached the point ashore that was directly opposite the anchored Arctic. The lighthouse assistant pulled the reins to stop the horse opposite the Arctic at the same time John Brotch had spotted him. The man ashore reached into his USLHE saddlebags to pull out a small 3-drawer spyglass, extended it, and, holding it up with both hands, put it up to his left eye. He could see the stern of the schooner as it was closest to shore, with its anchor line taut in from the bow. But he didn't see any damage, such as missing masts, booms, or rigging that would indicate the ship was in distress. "Looks like it's just waiting out the storm," Assistant Carrigan thought to himself for a moment, as he continued eyeing the rest of the vessel with his spyglass while seated in the saddle. Then, as he continued to study it, he was able to read the stern board. Arctic on the stern's top port side, and then, as the stern board curved down slightly to starboard, it said Milwaukee. Then, as he lowered the spyglass down to look at the rest of the stern, he saw it. The rudder was missing. No rudder. This was a ship in distress. At the same moment that he noticed the rudder was gone, he saw a crew member come to the stern's ship's rail. The captain, he thought to himself. Then he saw the man raise up his arm and fire a pistol into the air. The assistant lighthouse keeper quickly lowered the spyglass from his eye to be able to take in the entire scene. Just as he did this, and refocused his eyes, he heard the report from the pistol reach him, followed by a brilliant white flare making an arc 200 feet into the air, and then back down into the water. "It's a flare," he said aloud to himself. "It's a distress signal. This ship is in distress. I must respond." Hurriedly, he put his spyglass back into the saddlebag on the right side, and then opened up the saddlebag on the left side. Inside it were 4 Coston flares. These were standard issue to all USLHE posts, to use by the keepers for emergency signalling to ships in distress. The ships were the utmost in simplicity, being just a flare attached to a wooden handle. The assistant grabbed one of these out of the saddlebag, held it out away from him, and pulled the lanyard. The flare ignited, and, as it did so, the assistant raised it over his head, and waved it from side to side until it burned out in about 1 minute. Just as fast now, Daniel Carrigan, now officially a rescuer, dropped his Coston flare onto the beach and reached for his right saddlebag to pull out his spyglass again. He quickly drew its 3 drawers back open and focused on the stern of the Arctic. There, standing at its stern rail, he could see many men now. The entire crew, he thought to himself, as he eyed the stern. Then he saw one of the men with a spyglass extended. "The captain," he said to himself. Then it dawned on him. He and Captain John Brotch were looking at each other at the same time through each other's spyglasses. He saw the captain lower his glass and wave, then raise the glass to his eye again. "My turn," said the lone rescuer aloud to himself, and he immediately set his spyglass down on the saddle so it balanced horizontally in front of him, and returned the wave with both arms. Then he grabbed the glass and looked back. The crew at the stern were all waving now, and with that the first part of this rescue was ended. He put the spyglass back into the saddle-bag, secured it with its leather strap and buckle, and then let loose the reins to put the horse into a fast and furious full gallop back along the 2-mile beach south to the lighthouse, where he could notify his superior that a rescue was indeed needed. "He sees us!" yelled John Brotch to his crew as he studied the man ashore through his captain's spyglass. "He's galloping off now at full speed. Gotta be one of the keepers at the lighthouse. I saw USLHE on one of the horse's saddlebags. He was out patrolling the shore, looking for ships in distress like us. He's going to go tell the staff at the lighthouse, who will notify the U.S. Life-Saving Service. We're going to be rescued." And Arctic's crew all cheered. "Well, Edward, all we have to do now is hope the anchor and line holds until they get here," said John Brotch. Chapter 46. Daniel Carrigan, the Fort Gratiot lighthouse assistant, now rescuer, made the 2 miles back south down the beach in just 6 minutes. He disembarked from the horse fast, put it in the barn, closed the door, and then ran the 50 feet over to the lighthouse, where he knew Keeper Israel Palmer was waiting for him. "Ship in distress!" Carrigan hollered, after barely entering the front door of the station, breathlessly holding on to it after his run. "It's the schooner Arctic. Its rudder is gone, and it's hanging on for dear life by its anchor and anchor line." "Let's telegraph Sand Beach," said Keeper Palmer. Sand Beach was the name of the nearest U.S. Life-Saving Service, USLSS, station, whose business was to rescue ships in distress. Unfortunately, it was 50 miles away to the north along the beach. There were no rescue helicopters in 1894, and there were only 2 means of rescue. For ships close to shore, rigging a line, rigged between the ships and the shore to haul crew members above the water, clinging to a breech's buoy, as previously discussed. The second means of rescue was by taking a small boat, essentially a 25-foot lifeboat, with 3 oars per side, and rowing out from the shore into and beyond the raging surf to reach the stricken vessel when it was beyond the range of the breech's buoy. But, being 50 miles to the north, it would be impossible for the U.S. Life-Saving Service crew at Sand Beach, the closest, to make it down, let alone bring their small boat with them, towed by horseback along the beach. Still, the Sand Beach USLSS station had to be notified. The only method to do this was via telegraph. Its lines ran along the railroad tracks north from the lighthouse up to the Sand Beach station. The front door of the lighthouse tower, where Assistant Carrigan had hollered distress to the keeper, opened into a main room, where various equipment was stored. The living quarters for themselves and their families was in another purpose-built building, about 75 yards further inland from the tower. So what space the lighthouse had was used to store things needed for the job. In addition to providing storage space, the USLHE had also installed in this room a telegraph that sat on a desk over in the corner. Not much space was needed for it, just room for the generator, which was wound by hand, and then the Morse-sending key and headset. Both the keeper and assistant were trained by the USLHE and certified as Morse code operators. "The question is if the lines are still up, given this gale," said Keeper Palmer. He sat down with Assistant Carrigan standing next to him, wound up the generator, put on the headset, and started to tap away. "SBS, this is FGL, over," tapped out Palmer on the Morse code set. These letters were their respective Morse code call signs, to avoid having to type out their long names to save time. The letters FGL stood for Fort Gratiot Light, while SBS represented Sand Beach Station. He got an immediate reply. "FGL, this is SBS, Roger, over," replied the Morse code operator for the Harbour Beach life-saving station. It was standard procedure that after a storm the Morse code set be manned continuously by the USLSS until an all-clear was given that all distressed ships had been dealt with by all appropriate stations. "This is FGL, Schooner Arctic in distress, no rudder, anchored 2 miles northeast FGL, 3/4 mile from shore," tapped the keeper. "This is SBS, wait," responded the Sand Beach Morse operator. "He's going to tell his station head," said Palmer to Carrigan. After just 2 minutes, the reply came back. "SBS unable to assist. SBS rescuing schooner William Shoop off Point Sanilac, 30 miles to north of FGL. Port Huron tug damaged first attempt. SBS sending rescue boat down 25 miles by rail for second attempt. Suggest FGL secure second tug Port Huron to assist Arctic, over." "This is FGL, Roger out," dit-dotted Keeper Palmer on his Morse set. Then he took off his headset, set it on the table, and turned to look up at his assistant standing behind him. "Well," said Palmer, "they're busy with a different schooner, 10 miles north of the Arctic. Sounds like they contacted Port Huron for help earlier this morning, and a tug was sent up, got damaged in the waves, and had to turn around. Now they're loading their small boat onto a train to take it down to the site. They can't help, and suggest we see if a different tug in Port Huron can help. We're on our own." "Wonderful," said Carrigan. "All right," replied Palmer. "The light is working fine. That's our first and always our first priority. But it's working well, so let's go for it. I want you to get back on the horse and ride into town and down to the pier where they tie up the tugs. See if you can find one that's manned today, this Saturday noon, and ask if they can help. If you find one that can, then tell them we'll be observing from the tower, and after they effect the rescue and start to head back in and go past the light, we'll bring down the carriage to pick up the captain and crew and bring them back up here to the light. We can accommodate them for a couple days, since tomorrow is Sunday, and nothing will be in operation, and they'll be stranded otherwise. I'm sure the captain won't have money for 2 nights' room and board in a hotel for his crew." "I'm on it," exclaimed Assistant Carrigan, and ran out the lighthouse tower door and back to the barn. The wind was still whipping up pretty strong as he opened the barn door. Thankful he'd not taken the time to remove the saddle, he hopped back on the horse, and off he went down the dirt road and into town. He didn't gallop this time, still a bit unsure of himself, and not wanting to press his luck, but he did trot, which was enough to save some time. Chapter 47. "Ahoy!" shouted the assistant lighthouse keeper, as he brought the horse alongside the 2 tugboats tied up next to each other on the pier in the harbour of Port Huron, Michigan. Almost immediately he saw one of the tug's captains he knew poke his head around and outside of the pilot-house door. He saw the tug's nameplate just below the pilot-house windows on the port side closest to the pier, C.D. Thompson. "What do you need?" replied the tug's captain, recognizing the sentinel as one of the lighthouse operators. "There's a schooner in distress," answered Dan Carrigan. "Can you help?" "Already tried, right after dawn this morning," replied the tug captain. "Couldn't help them. The waves were too big. They were so powerful they smashed in a couple of my bullocks, and me and the crew are working to repair them. Sorry, can't help." "What was that schooner's name?" replied the assistant, remembering the Morse message from the Sand Beach life-saving station of a failed attempt by a Port Huron tug to rescue a different schooner further north. "The William Shoop," replied the captain. "Why?" "This one's the Arctic. said Carrigan. "Well, we saw that one at anchor as we passed it going north," the tug captain responded. "Looked okay to us. Figured it was just riding out the storm." "Its rudder is gone," said the assistant. "How do you know that?" replied the captain. "Because I rowed up on the beach to get a closer look. With the east-southeast wind you had this morning, you would have only seen the bow, since it would have turned into the wind at anchor, right?" "Gosh, I never thought of that. You sure the rudder's gone? I mean, it's just around the corner. With the wind coming from the east now, it could practically limp back the 2 miles to the safety of the St. Clair River." "I observed with my spyglass from the beach. The rudder is gone. Then its captain came out to the stern and fired a distress flare that I saw and acknowledged with a roston. The wind has died down some since you tried that rescue after dawn, but it's still about 30 miles per hour. If that anchor line breaks, they're going to be blown onto the beach and be smashed by the waves. The US LSS at Sand Beach told me and my keeper only a half-hour ago they can't help. They're focused totally on the shoop. This tugboat company has 2 tugs. This one was damaged this morning trying to get to the shoop and can't make it, but the one tied right in front of us can. It's a much smaller one, though, as you can see, which is why we couldn't make it back up to the shoop to try again. It just couldn't take 30 miles up and back in those waves. Gonna still be hard to pull up alongside to get the crew of this one." "You might not have to pull alongside. From what I observed from the beach about a half-hour ago, everything appears to be intact, with no damage, just the rudder. So you might only have to toss them a line for a tow back to port, and never go alongside." "Let's go, then," hollered the tug captain. He called his crew up from working on the damaged bulwarks below, and they immediately went to the next tug. "It'll take us about 30 minutes to make steam. Do you want to go with us?" "Love to," replied Carrigan, "but my keeper told me just to sound the alarm and get back to the light. When you get the schooner towed back, as you tow it back past the light, I'll come back down in the horse and carriage to get the crew. With tomorrow being Sunday, they'll need a place to stay, and the keeper says we can provide them food and lodging up at our quarters at the light until Monday morning." "Very well. I'll see you then when we get back, assuming we make it." And the captain started barking orders to light the coal boiler to make the steam needed to power the tug. "Thank you for helping," said Carrigan. "We never desert a fellow mariner. It will always be all hands on deck to help our own." The assistant then turned the horse around and headed back up to the light. Once he arrived, he informed the keeper a tug was on its way, and, waiting the 20 minutes that Carrigan estimated required for the tug to get steam up so it could get under way, both he and Palmer then climbed the stairs to stand in front of the tall windows in front of the light. As they did so, sure enough, off to the right, coming north on the St. Clair River, and out into Lake Huron, came the little tug company's second, small tug. It slowly steamed past them, and they followed it as it approached the Arctic, still clinging to life through its single anchor chain. As the tug reached the Arctic, it turned to port just past it, and stopped dead in the water about 100 feet away. The keeper and the assistant at the top of the lighthouses could see through their spyglasses that the tug captain had his megaphone out, and was communicating with the stranded Arctic's captain. "Ahoy, Arctic!" hollered the tug captain through his megaphone on the port wing of the pilot-house. "Ahoy!" replied John Brotch. He and the Arctic's crew had all seen the tug coming, taking a deep breath that rescue was at hand. John had run down into the cabin to get his own megaphone. "Do you require assistance?" yelled the tug captain. "Aye!" hollered Captain Brotch. "Our rudder is gone, blown off in the storm. Can't manoeuvre. Can you give us a tow to Port Huron Harbour?" "Aye, we're ready for you," replied the tug captain. Then he hollered for his crew at the tug's stern to stand by to throw over a line to the schooner. When they were ready, the tug captain slowly and gingerly reversed engines and swung the rudder to starboard, so that the tug's stern was near the Arctic's bow. He got as close as he could in this wind, only now dropping a little below 30 miles per hour, and especially the still huge waves. When he got as close as he could, about 25 feet, he ordered his deckhands astern to throw over the line to Arctic's crew, who John Brotch had just told to prepare to accept a tow line from the tug. Lines, or ropes, were often transferred from one vessel to another by attaching a small line, easily thrown with a weight on one end of it to a full-size and much heavier rope. The small line was caught by the crew on the ship, to be towed, then pulled across. Since the smaller rope is attached to the bigger rope, the full-size rope could then be pulled over much easier. Attempting to pull over the full-size line on its own would not be possible, because it's so heavy, especially if it gets dragged through the water, which basically doubles its weight. The tug also had a shotgun, to which the smaller rope would be attached to a weight that went inside the barrel of the gun. This weight, when fired, would then go out 10 feet or more, if necessary. But, in this case, the tug's crew could throw the smaller line the 25 feet without a problem. The Arctic's crew caught the smaller line, then pulled it across, and with it the attached bigger, stronger rope to be used for the tow. The tow rope now aboard, the Arctic's crew secured it to the bow of the schooner. Then they turned to the stern to face Captain Brotch and gave him a thumbs up. "Line secure, ready for the tow," hollered John Brotch to his counterpart on the tug. "Aye, our line secured this side as well. All hands stand by to begin the tow," yelled the tug captain through his megaphone, to both the crew of his tug and the crew of the Arctic. He then moved the small brass engine telegraph in the tug's pilot house to ahead 1/3, received the reply of the bells and telegraph movement from the engine room, and the tug started to move forward. Slowly, the tug's crew astern paid out the line, so that eventually 100 yards of rope extended between it and the Arctic. Once all the line was out, the tug's crew tied it securely, then stood silently as everyone on both vessels watched the line come up out of the water and become taut as the tug moved ahead. While the tug's crew was letting out the line, John Brotch ordered his crew to haul up the anchor. The timing was perfect, since just as the anchor left the water, the tow line went taut, and the Arctic began to move. John Brotch ordered the anchor to be secured, and then for the crew to stand at their stations to prepare to enter port to tie up to the pier. He saw a crew member bend over and kiss the anchor as soon as it was secured to the rail, a simple thanks for saving their lives. There was nothing left now for the Arctic to do until the tow was complete. It took only 30 minutes to reach the pier in Port Huron harbour. The tug, tow lines now released and stowed, manoeuvred to push at the Arctic side to move it up against the pier. When it nearly reached it, John Brotch raised his hands for the tug to stop. Then the Arctic's crew jumped onto the pier and secured the lines. The Arctic had made it ashore. Thanks for watching. This photograph isn't about Bayview or its lake captains, but it's from the same era of Great Lakes maritime history. We thought we'd close with it for enjoyment, as it captures the spirit of the era. If you'd like to read how this adventure for Captain John Brotch and his crew of the schooner Arctic concluded, you can purchase the book from which it was taken, A Brother Helps His Sister, The True Story of William A. Draves, the schooner Arctic, and the house at 515 East Lincoln Avenue, that is available for sale now at henschelhousebooks.com and on Amazon.com in both ebook and paperback form, being released in individual volumes. Note also the book contains all of the accompanying sources for these chapters. In addition, this channel and its matching website also plan to support various maritime history projects related to Bayview's lake captains. One of these is a plaque and marker with the captains' names and addresses on it, as part of the creation of the Bayview Lake Captains Historic District, which will be the first of its kind in America. Website contributions and book profits both go to support these projects. Note, we are not a 501(c)(3) and contributions are not tax-deductible. If you would like to contribute to support these projects, to include this and other markers honouring Bay View's lake captains, with 100% of all donations and contributions in all forms going to support them, please consider contributing to us through the listings shown in the closing credits, which can also be found on our website shown at the end. If, for some reason, we are unable to secure these markers, then all funds donated to this site will be given as a cash donation to the museum ship SS City of Milwaukee in Manistee, Michigan. That is the only surviving intact ship, once captained by at least 2, and likely 3 different Bay View Lake captains. I'm Simon Stanhope, narrator for these episodes. Join us again soon for the next chapter of Bay View, Town of Lake Captains.